enthusiast tradition. Please welcome David Swig.
Thank you, everybody. We're still getting the mic turned on here, so bear with us for a moment. Thank you. So, really the real guest of honor today is not me, but it's the man sitting to my right, Mr. Bill Jankowski, who came down here from Reno, Nevada to talk to us a little bit today. And Bill is a fascinating guy who I've known for most of my life. And what we're here to talk about today is a car that Bill built in the early 1950s. Bill had a fascinating career that encompassed aerospace, engineering, and went on to form and run a successful tire testing business for a number of decades, where he was doing winter tire testing in Yellowstone in negative 30-degree temperatures and things like that. But what we're here to talk about today is what Bill was doing in the early 1950s. And for those of you who remember that period, you'll know that it was really a golden age of American sports car racing. And it was a very unique period because you could actually, somebody with some ingenuity like Bill could actually build a car essentially out of junkyard parts and go and race against the best that Europe had to offer and run oftentimes at the front with Ferrari 250 Testarossas and Maseratis and things like that. You know, probably the most famous guy who built cars like this was Max Jankowski with his old Yeller series of cars. But there was a whole other group of guys who built their own cars and successfully raced them. And these days it's 2024. Bill started building this car 71 years ago, as we were talking about yesterday. And frankly, there's not a whole number of guys left who were there back then and actually raced and can talk firsthand about racing against guys like Carroll Shelby and against guys like Jim Hall, who later went and built the Chaparral cars. So we're going to get into a little bit of that today. And I'm glad to see so many Monserati hats out there. I'm glad those were a hit. So thank you guys all for coming. And let's give Bill a round of applause for coming here all the way from Reno. So Bill, take us back to the early 1950s. You were an...
Let me do something first.
Please.
On behalf of all the special builders who build cars and were part of the foundation of this great sport of road racing, I thank you for coming.
So Bill, in 1952, early 53, you're an engineering student at SMU in Dallas, and I guess you learned about sports car racing. You came from, I guess, more of an American hot rodding sort of background. Tell us about the origins of how you had the idea to build this car, and what was that all about? What was your inspiration for creating the Monserati?
Well, I'd started off fooling around with motorcycles, but I always wanted to get involved with sports cars. But being in college and so forth, finances were a problem. I considered looking at getting involved maybe with the production small car, but I wanted to go fast with the big guys.
You didn't want to drive an MGTD.
I did not say that. My wife had 3 TFs over the span of the time we were together, and I love the TF. So we'll keep you in mind.
We got some MG love here. We're going to get back to that later on.
Anyway, got to thinking, how can we do this? There was an issue of Road and Track that presented a car called the Manning Special that you see up there. Manning was an aircraft structural engineer who came up with this car. And it, for the time and for the power that it had, it did a pretty good job. But I couldn't get one. had very few facilities. I didn't have a welder. If I had needed a weld, I borrowed one. I didn't have a bandsaw, so I used a hacksaw to cut things, and so on and so forth. So it was pretty rudimentary. I didn't have the option of building the fine frame that his blueprints offered. So I did the next best thing, was to obtain and modify a 1939 Ford chassis that was very bare. But it did utilize the rear axle and the front axle, and that was a good start. Modified the frame, beefed it up by cutting another section out of another frame and welding it on there. So it was crude, but it worked out well.
So just a bit of context, Bill was getting into sports car racing, and really the most popular, really performance car that you could buy in 1952 that wasn't an XK120 was an Allard. And I think that an Allard was sort of the top for you at that
An Allard
time.
was the epitome because it had the power, and interestingly enough, the suspension on the Allard was a takeoff of this of the Fords with the solid axle, except I believe they split the front axle and so forth. So it was just the thing I would like to have been able to afford but couldn't.
So as a poor engineering student, Bill could not afford a J2X, but there was this guy, Chuck Manning, who had built a flathead powered special, Mercury Ford flathead powered special, and he actually offered mail order plans basically on how to build your own flathead powered road racing hot rod special. And these plans were offered in things like Road and Track. And so Bill, as a young engineering student, bought the mail order plans and decided to make his own car. So here, this is early 1953, and you're literally sketching on a yellow pad or something what this car is going to look like.
That's right.
Trying to figure out what to do. December 1953, Bill purchases a 1939 Ford chassis. What do you pay for that? About 20 bucks? That would have been too much.
Oh, a little, maybe 30. Anyway, as you can see, it started off as a junkyard special. Now, you do not have the privilege to call it a junkyard special. I do, but not you. So that's my backyard.
71 years ago, you were building this car, Bill.
That's right. Long time ago. But anyway, the car went through iterations. This shows you where we have the Ford flathead engine in there, because at that time, the well-known Chevy V8 had not come quite out yet. They had some other overhead valve engines, but we couldn't afford that.
In the early 50s, basically, you were still running a Ford flathead, and I think before the small block Chevy came out, maybe an Olds Rocket 88 was kind of a hot ticket, but before 55, a flathead was still potentially competitive in road racing, correct?
That's right.
So Bill actually corrected me that the caption is wrong. Bill corrected me yesterday that this picture is probably actually taken in late 55 or maybe early 56. And you can see the car coming together. So again, 39 Ford frame, Mercury flathead motor, and here the car is finally in running and driving operational condition. The body was the last thing that you built, correct?
That's right. Believe it or not, and we're going to have another picture on, this car was registered in Texas with a VIN number, and I could drive it on the street. All you had to have were some headlights, taillights, and a horn. So I took my mother out driving in this one time, managed to get a ticket out of White Rock Lake in Dallas, and but it would go on the road legally.
So Bill, you built this car basically in your parents' garage in Dallas. You were telling me yesterday that the garage wasn't wide enough to get the axles out of the car.
Yeah, we had to punch holes in the wall in order to slide the axles out.
And you know, you got the car running and driving. You were telling me yesterday that you actually were able to license the car and drive it on the street before it had a body on it.
That's right.
And you drove it in this form a little bit in 55, and you were sort of just getting acclimated to the SCCA scene, and in 55, 56, you actually volunteered as a flagger, and you were flagging SCCA races on the air bases in Texas, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. In 55 and 56, I actually flagged at the course where I made my debut with this. And but prior to the race, we had an opportunity. You notice the body, you can't tell it, but it was the fiberglass had never been painted, and it was complete but barely. So we were invited to a hill climb in Austin, Texas. We took it down there, and ended up running second overall. But the interesting thing was that that night we'd worked late, so after I made my first run, went back down the hill, lay down and went to sleep. Somebody put a piece of masking tape on it with the following designation, 007 Monserati. Now that's where the name came from. Prior to that, it was Jankowski Special. I never liked having my name in the car. I just didn't like that. But the Monserati, that was so unique. I never found out who did it.
And the name, by the way, has been a source of some confusion over the years. I've definitely been standing in the paddock in the races next to the car and have some guy come up and say to his friend, oh yeah, it has a Maserati engine in it. But, you know, things like that. People think that it was built on a Maserati frame, or, you know, people have all sorts of ideas. There are no Maserati parts on this car whatsoever, just to clarify.
Absolutely not.
It would be worth a little more if you had used some Maserati parts, probably.
It might be, yeah.
So, you know, Bill, you bring the car. This is April 1957 at this hill climb in Austin, where you brought the car for one of your earlier
Right,
events.
and this is just prior to the introduction of the car at Eagle Mountain at a big national race at Eagle Mountain near Fort Worth. I, of course, was a member of SCCA section, and they wanted to have a big turnout. So they need to get people like myself licensed. So they had prior to that, they had a little small race just to see how you did. So I went out there and I didn't finish it because the carburetor jet got loose. But as a result of my simply competing in that little petite race, as they call it, I got a national license. Don't think you can do that these days.
I know the SCCA is still struggling for members today. So they gave you a national license after one petite race, and then you're lining up on the grid next to Carol Shelby.
Now this was the third race that third yearly race it had at Eagle Mountain. This was an abandoned military facility between Dallas and Fort Worth. And it turned out to be the most, I won't say frightening because I wasn't smart enough to be frightened, the worst race in rain that I've ever seen. I have pictures of them. It left plumes of water. In the first turn on the second day, Sunday, O'Shea and Shelby came together in the first turn and crashed their cars. I never saw the first turn. It just went through.
So Bill, this is a photo from that rain-soaked 1957 SCCA national event at Eagle Mountain. So this is your first major road. You had done some, you were telling me yesterday, you got the car done, you had done some sort of gymkhana, autocross type events. You did the Austin hill climb, you did the driver's school and the petite race at Eagle Mountain. And then here you are in the big time, SCCA National, in the pouring rain, and you're on the grid with Carroll Shelby. I mean, you're a kid who just kind of stumbled into this. What was it like racing against guys like Carroll Shelby and Jim Hall?
Actually, this race drew a large number of West Coast drivers. They didn't yet develop to the point where there are a lot of the big trailers that you see now. But it was well attended. And this race was so bad in the conditions that it was run. They ran production and modified cars together. This race, a national, was won by a Corvette. It beat the Maseratis, the Ferraris, the DJs. It beat them all. It was Dr. Dick Thompson who was in there.
I just want to go back here. Great shot from Mansfield, Louisiana, 1957.
One other thing, right after this race, two items. First, I did not finish either race. The water was so bad, I spun in each race. The distributor on a flathead Ford is mounted directly on the front of the engine, driven by the camshaft. So you can imagine, once you killed it, it wasn't going to start again. But we did follow with this car right after the race. I then took my sister and we drove from Dallas up to my old home in Nebraska and back on the street. It was a versatile car that would go any place.
Bill, I think you called it the dual-purpose sports car when you built it. It was not a pure race car then. It was a dual-purpose street car and race car, correct?
Well, I guess so. One of the interesting things in the trip from Dallas to Nebraska and back, just out of Dallas, it blew a head gasket. Well, I got towed into a speed shop, got a cylinder, as you know. It's easy to replace the head gasket on the flathead. I did it right out there, and we went on up to Nebraska and came back. So it was a very dual-purpose car and legal.
So, Bill, you were fairly new to the sports car scene. You're with a lot of people who had a fair amount of bucks in their pocket, the Jim Hall type guys who were Texas oil money, that sort of thing. This is a great photo from Mansfield, Louisiana. You can see some of the production cars on an airport track behind you here. What did these sports car guys think about this sort of crude-looking V8 powered special when you showed up with it? What sort of reaction did you get?
Well, the reaction was sort of varied, particularly when
You're very diplomatic.
Yeah. All in all, I found people very receptive, and I want to point out that the specials that were built were, to a certain extent, the one way that poorer people could get involved in sports car racing, and I just want to thank you right now for your interest in this, because the specials are fading, unfortunately. We're still getting one out, getting the Monserati out. They're old, they're not the original, but a copy of the Manning special is still run frequently, and a couple of others too. But there was a time in the past 20 years where you would have 9 or more specials. It's just sort of sad to see that they're gone, but they made racing available to a lot of people who couldn't have done it.
So, Bill, it took you, when you started building this car, it was 1953, and at that time the flathead was sort of the way to go. It took you 2 or 3 years to really get this car on the road and in a race-ready form, and by sort of 57, when the car was in its finished form, the flathead had become sort of obsolete because you had small block Chevys now, and you saw a route to greater performance. And in 1958, I believe, early 58, you put a small block Chevy in the car. So this photo is February 1959. Now at a permanent race circuit. They had been racing on abandoned airport tracks mostly U.S. military airfields.
Yeah, that was Green Valley, which they even held Trans Am races there. So, go ahead.
Talk about the switch from flathead to Chevrolet Power and what that did for you from a performance standpoint. I mean, you know, look, you built this car for $900 in 1953 money. Here you are with a Ferrari. There's a lot of photos actually of your car with this particular 250 Testarossa, which is chassis number 0714. There's a lot of photos of your car racing against this car. This car might have been a $14,000 or $15,000 car at the time.
Yeah,
tell us about racing against these, you know, rich guys with big, important.
That was Gary
European
Laughlin, a well-known oil man. Many of the drivers who raced with success and expensive cars were oil men in Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. So that made it a little tough. You also were going through the period of car of the year. If you had car X this year, 57 or 58, the next year their new one would come out. If you didn't have that one, your chances of doing anything were pretty poor.
So this photo I included, this is later on in your career. This is 1960 in San Marcos, Texas, which I believe is another airfield track. And really just pointing out the variety of cars. Here's the Monserati, of course. In 1960, you're seeing the shift from front-engine cars like the Testarossa, the Maserati 200 here, the Monserati, to rear-engine cars like the 4-cam, looks like a Porsche RSK or RS60 there. You've got some sort of Cooper here. So you were driving this car really in a period of great change in sports car racing, weren't you?
Yes. One thing I want to point out, that at that time in the 50s, there were no fixed road courses in Texas, Oklahoma, or Louisiana. So old, either currently used or old abandoned airports were utilized. Texas was the home of a great deal of pilot training. As a result of that, there were many airports. There would be, I should say, runaways out. You couldn't land all the airplanes one time at the training site, so these were out there in the open, way in the booties, and they were triangular in shape. The reason that they were triangular, so that you would always have a choice of landing directly into the wind, but there was nothing there. So they were available, weren't being used, so they were converted to road courses, if you will, through the use of hay bales. One other thing that you'll notice, and this was a fairly active airport, the fact that the people were standing on the edge of the concrete. At Mansfield, Louisiana, for instance, the cars were printed on the asphalt and concrete, and yet the pit and all the support gear were in the background. That's where you parked your car. You were right there.
And another thing you'll notice is before the days of Bring a Trailer in Haggerty Marketplace, this is how you sold your car. So Bill, this was very much an effort that involved your family and friends, and this is a photo from pits, I think at Hilltop Raceway in Louisiana, you were saying. So you had a group of close friends, Bob Gast and Paul Lamb being two of the key guys who helped you actually construct the car. Your dad and your sister were sort of involved in being at the races and helping as pit crew.
And my mother never went to a race.
So tell us about, like, what was your crew at the time? How did you get this thing to the races? How did you get it done?
Well, we finally built a trailer. But one of the things I want to point out about Hilltop, this was the first special build racetrack in the area. And we were going pretty well. There were 3 Hilltop weekends in a row, and each one the Monserati set the absolute course record and expanding each time. Now the downside, never won it. Had a flat tire, blew an engine, and something else I don't remember. But this was the place where the Monserati really showed up against the D-Jags that even those had Chevrolet powered in them and so forth. So they were great times.
By the way, I should have mentioned we will have a Q&A at the end if we don't cover enough of the stuff. But if you have any questions as we're going through the presentation, please feel free to put your hand up, and we're happy to call on you.
Yeah, we don't want to make this a one-way presentation.
So Hilltop was a permanent, what they would call a European-style road racing course that was built outside of Bossier City, Louisiana, and Bill got to run there in the early 60s. The part that Bill conveniently left out is that the Monserati was actually spun off into a dry lake, which became known as Jankowski Lake, correct?
We agreed not to talk about that.
I forgot that part, sorry about that. So Bill, you had your trials and tribulations with this car, and it wasn't always a walk in the park. You had issues with powertrains, you had issues with braking axles and various things as you were sorting this car out. At some point, you kind of got fed up with the Monserati. You didn't get out of racing. You went on to buy a Lotus 18 Formula Junior, and you kept racing. But tell us about, in 1962, you decided to sell the car. What led to that decision, and tell us a little about that.
Well, I was a little distressed with the fact that sometimes it ran well, but lots of times it didn't finish, and that's no fun. I'll be honest with you, I did the engine building because I couldn't afford a professional engine builder. But I was never really a great engine builder. I didn't have the equipment to do it and that sort of thing. So I said, maybe it's time to move on. I'd sell the car, get this 18. The problem was, the 20s were already out and the 21s were about to come, or 22s. So you know, in that field, if you're not the latest car, you're not going to be a winner unless you're darn lucky. So I finally decided, I sold the 18 and dropped out of racing for over 20 years after that.
Bill, it strikes me that you swung pretty hard from one end of the pendulum to another, because the Monserati was about torque, which is stated on the hand-painted plaque that's still on the car today. So you went away from torque and you went to a mid-engine, small displacement formula car. That was a big shift for you, wasn't it?
Yeah, but I always enjoyed the open wheel cars. You can see the wheels, you know where you're placing it, and they handle quite well. In fact, they probably brake better than this. This had the 39 Ford drums and disc brakes, drums and shoe brakes on it. So that was always a limitation as to just how fast you could stop.
So, Bill, you sold the car in 1962. It ended up being driven by a guy named Tim White, who road raced the car for a few years, and then I think it was sold to someone else and got turned into a big block drag race car. This is 1962, after you sold the car. However, we were talking about this yesterday. This is a track that you actually raced on. This is at the Oklahoma City Fairgrounds, and you had some specific reminiscences about this course, which I think you can see how dangerous some of the SCCA road racing was at this time. I mean, we're literally on the ring roads around a county fairgrounds. You've got signposts and buildings and curbs and not a whole lot of runoff. But what I think is interesting about this photo, this is 10 years after the car was built, essentially, 1962, and you look at what's on the grid here. You got 250 Testarossa, you got a Maserati Birdcage, you got Monserati, you got a Porsche Speedster back there, you got a 10-year-old C-Type Jag, just quite a Devons and other sorts of specials in here. Quite a diverse field of cars. Anything particular you want to say about this Oklahoma City course, Bill?
Yeah, Oklahoma City was one of our really better races. I won on Saturday. Unfortunately, I had to use the brakes so hard, we had to totally rebuild them overnight. They were.
I never used the brakes that hard.
Against disc brakes.
I said I never used the brakes that hard.
Anyway, one on Saturday over Ronnie Hissom in his Chevy Lister, and then I was second overall on Sunday behind Hissom. But during the course of that race, I had started off in third position, and I was behind Jack Hinkle, who was a major SCCA administrator, with his birdcage. And as we were coming around the corner and going up the straight, he suddenly lost it big time, and he backed it into a pole. Just put the most beautiful U-shape you've ever seen in the back of a Monserati. Fortunately, it didn't leak, so I went on Sunday and finished second, but I'm sure Hinkle was very confused that a special would be, of that value would be giving him a chase for the money.
So Bill, you sold the car in 1962, you went on, you raced the Lotus 18 for a few years, then ultimately you got busy with your career and the company you started, and you kind of moved away from racing. At some point, I think somebody invited you out to one of the early Monterey Historics events, and you sort of got the idea of maybe the Monserati is somewhere still around, and maybe you could go vintage racing in it if you could find it. Tell us about that.
Well, it was in early 80s. At that time, I was working at Lockheed on a special multi-purpose military vehicle. And I got word of vintage racing. I hadn't heard of it at all. So,
had you thought about the Monserati since 1962 when you sold it? Did you ever give that car another thought?
Not really, to be honest with you. If you're a racer, you always want to keep racing. But if you have to quit, why, you don't forget that you want to race still. And that was always in the back of my mind. I sat on the hill overlooking the straightaway at Laguna with going into turn one, and I saw this thing. This was fabulous. These were the cars I used to race with, and they were having a lot of fun. So my thought was, can I find the old Monserati? Well, I looked and looked. It took 2 years. Finally, one day, Bob Gast, who had helped me with the car, called up and said, I got a fellow who says he has the old Monserati and he's going to rebuild it. Well, I got back to Dallas a number of times, so I went out and talked to him, and he said, it sort of looked like this, it was butchered. He said, I'm going to get it finished. He had started, but I said, okay, I will wait him out. It took another year, and then he called me up and said, you're interested in buying it? Well, he wanted more than and that was with a lousy engine and transmission, than I had paid to build the whole car. But
You wanted $1,500 for the car. Too much.
So anyway, I bought it without the engine because that was just trash, and got it back. Unfortunately, due to the press of business, it sat there for at least 2 years. And then I started, as we were getting closer to my able to slow down, I started rebuilding it, and this was a total restoration. It went down to the bare frame, and built it up from them. The advantage we had now, I was going to put of course, a Chevy in there, and with a 4-speed transmission. With the old transmission I had, the 39 Ford, it was effectively 2-speed because the first was not synchro. So you just had 2 gears. So
this was really a courtship because you found this guy in Texas, he had your car, And you and your wife, Joe, really had to sort of wait, as you said, wait him out and convince him that you should really have the car back. This is a letter that Joe, your wife, wrote in 1984 to the guy, basically saying that you had a wonderful talk with him. You sent him some photos to show him, how it should be restored. But ultimately, he didn't restore it, I guess, and you were able to buy the car back.
That's right. And but when I got it back, I was still awfully busy in the business, and so it sat there for a couple of years. But then, as I say, I learned about vintage racing, and I said, we're going to do this. My wife was a total supporter of my racing. She went to all of them and just loved it. And of course, that's the way we met many years prior to that. So, an interesting story. I was able to get the chassis and that sort of work done, but I had to have the engine. Well, a guardian angel came around, a fellow by the name of John Thawley. Maybe you old timers remember John, who wrote some very fine books. John had contacts and worked for GM, Edelbrock, and all of those people. And he said, Bill, I think I can do something for you, because the first race at Monterey in August of 86 was featured in Marcus Chevrolet. Said, I think I can do something for you. Now, I'm going to tell you a story, and it's the honest gosh truth. I couldn't, we tried to find the letter. John wrote Herb Fischel, the chairman of racing for GM. He said, look, this is a good year, a GM year. Why don't you loan this fellow an engine? He did. It was built by one of their suppliers who builds special engines like they would build for something that GM would sponsor. So I got the engine. It was always interesting because the builders said, we've never done anything with a 3.2 barrel carburetor, and we've never done anything with a wet sump. And as you know, that's what we're. I tried to keep the engine as original as possible. I didn't want to upgrade the carburation, and I wasn't going to upgrade the oil system. So we got the engine, ran in June of 86, and I finished back in the field, but I hadn't raced for 20 years. So after the race was over, the builder of the engine called me up and said, look, I have no use for an engine like we build for you. We don't do wet sumps anymore. They're all dry sumps. Said, would you be interested in buying this engine for $5,500? I said, sold. The thing I learned here was if you're not an engine builder, and I never pretended I was, if you get an engine builder to give you a good engine, racing is 10 times more comfortable because you're not working on the engine all the time. The car is running. You're concentrating on your driving. So as a result of that, I kept using that engine, and then as time went on, I was able to buy another engine from them, and I never built another engine.
So Bill had his second career with the Monserati, which lasted another 22 years and 83 race weekends in the vintage racing career. And I got to know Bill, you brought the car out again in 86, and I think it was probably 87 or 88 when I was about 4 years old, when my dad started bringing me by your pit stall.
Yeah, I want to affirm that. He would come by the pit, and he was this tall. And at every race that we went to that he attended, he came by and looked at the car. Little did I know that years later, he would be driving the car. And he's, by the way, he's done a fine job of carrying on the lineage for the Monserati.
So, Bill, this was sort of the second golden era for you with the Monserati. You brought the car back out. You got very friendly with David Love, who most people in this room know of or knew.
That was number 9.
Founder of CSRG, who owned that 250 pontoon Testarossa for most of its life. Still a local car, actually. And then on the left side of the Monserati is the ex-John von Neumann Ferrari 625 TRC, which was owned for many, many years by our good friend Mike Callahan. And this was sort of a golden era for you, wasn't it, Bill?
Yes. You noticed that I was able to upgrade the pit facilities a little bit. We didn't quite have a big old trailer, but this worked fine. One of the things that was always interesting was the fact that people who came by looking at the pits, invariably they looked more at the Monserati than the very fine Maseratis. And I have a great, I would love to have owned one but didn't, but I have a great deal of respect, and we had some great racing together.
So this is Bill and Joe Jankowski, Bill's wife of many, many years. And you know, earlier in the presentation, I made a comment about MGs, which I know some of you found derogatory, and I said we were going to get back to that. So Bill and Joe actually met in around, I think, 1958, and it was because of the Monserati. As Bill mentioned earlier, Joe had an MGTF, and she was a sports car enthusiast, and she was a member of the MG Car Club. And I guess there weren't that many MGs in the Dallas area, I'm not sure, but they allowed Bill and the Monserati and other sports car owners to come and participate in their gymkhanas and various MG Car Club events. I think, Bill, you told me that you were working as a sort of helping with one of the MG Car Club events, and you were running the Monserati, and you met Joe at one of those events. I don't know if you want to tell that story.
Yeah, it was Salado, Texas, where we met, and I was going to be tech inspector for this weekend, so I couldn't get off work early, so I couldn't get down there until late in the evening. Didn't have a place to stay, so I slept in the car and so forth. Went through tech. Then they had a nice swimming pool there. I wandered out there. Some friends of mine said to Joe, "You ought to meet this guy." And their response, "That dirty old guy?" The rest is history, I tell you. When you're racing, it helps to have a wife who is supportive to you. It makes a big, big difference.
And Joe, while she is not around anymore, she passed away about 15 years ago, but she was a big part of the Monserati story. And Bill, when you were contemplating your retirement from racing, and Joe had gotten sick, ultimately you were thinking that you were going to maybe donate the car to the Peterson Museum or do something along those lines with it. I guess I really have Joe to thank, because she encouraged you to give the car to me and let me continue its racing legacy.
Yeah, I had talked to Bruce Meyer down in Los Angeles at the museum, and he said, we have a lot of cars down in the basement that will never be shown because they're there for tax write-offs. And he said, maybe you ought to find somebody to drive it. Well, this just simply confirmed what Joe had been saying. You ought to find somebody. And she said, I'll tell you who you ought to choose. That would be David Swig. It turned out to be an absolutely brilliant suggestion, and his fine driving has kept the Monserati out there long after I'm going to be gone here. But we got to keep those specials out there that are left.
So this was August 2008. Bill, you ran your Genie V8 powered sports racer and also the Monserati. You ran your last race that weekend, and after the 2008 Historics, we had a little ceremony in your pit, and you sold me the car for $5, which I think I got a pretty good deal on it. Sort of the rest after that is kind of in history, right?
That is history.
So I was 24 years old at this time, and you know, I'm a competitive guy. I like racing cars. I'm competitive by nature, and I had raced. We had some cars, but for those of you who knew my dad, which I know is a lot of you, we raced, but we didn't actually have any racing cars. We just had some street cars that we sort of put tape on the headlights and drove out onto the track. So I desperately wanted to have a competitive car, but I was never going to have one that my dad owned. And when this whole Monserati thing came up, it was like, wow, okay, you know, now I actually have a chance to at 24 years old, you know, you still think you might be a Formula One driver someday. You know, I thought, you know, this is my chance to really show the world what a wonderful driver David Swig is. So I'm 39 now. I don't have as much to prove these days, or at least it's less important.
Let me add a little bit to this. When the thought came up from Joe to give this to David, I thought, well, maybe I ought to clear this with his folks, because he's turning from early model 60 street cars to a very fast car. So Martin, David and I had dinner at near Sears Point, and I explained what I wanted to do. And I said, I won't do this unless you approve it. Now, Esther was not there. Fortunately, deal might have gone through.
She's not here either, you'll notice.
But but he approved. So what we did, we had a little checkout session, because I'd asked David, can you fit into that car? I was 5'10" at the time, and you're 6'3". He said, I will make myself fit. So I rented there's a little track out near Fernley, Nevada, a road course, pretty nice. So took the car out there, and I'll point out one thing, I did not bring a stopwatch. It was night where I wasn't going to play that game and see how fast he could go. So David went out there, made 10 laps, came in, said I feel pretty good. Went out there, made 10 laps, said, I could tell he was faster, but not once did he spin or do anything stupid. Third time out there, he said, this is great, that's all for today. So that cemented the agreement to give him the car.
So Bill, you had shared with me that your dream when you were vintage racing the car was always that you might beat one of the Scarabs, which I think we both agree was sort of the finest front-engine American sports car of all time. And so we ran this test at Fernley, and we did a couple of minor CSRG events, and then we're at Monterey in 2009, and it's sort of my first major event. This was the pre-reunion of Monterey 2009. And by the way, while I remember it, I do want to say a special acknowledgement to two people who came to the lunch today who have been involved in the Monserati. The first one is Jack Hunt, who was the person who came to my shop and taught me how to tie the Monserati onto my trailer, which is something my dad sure as hell couldn't teach me. So thank you, Jack. If you would stand up for a moment and acknowledge yourself. Thank you. And the second is Jer Brown, who supported me for about the first 8 or 10 years that I ran the car. Jerry, if you wouldn't mind standing up and saying acknowledgement. So we went to Monterey in 2009, and you know, I just run some CSRG events against some, you know, MGs and Alphas and stuff, and you know, here I am in the over 2-liter sports car grid, and I'm lined up next to Rob Walton in the Scarab, and it's like, you know, shit, we're in the big time now, and a lot of people are paying attention, so you know, do a good job and don't screw this up. And we had a very close, very wheel-to-wheel race, and it's the only time I've ever done so, because I think I was young and dumb when I was 24, and probably braver than I am now. And we actually beat the Scarab at the line at Laguna Seca. And it's probably the only time I've ever seen Bill Jankowski cry, because I came into the pits and you were in tears.
Well, Yeah, I was just exhilarated, I can tell you. I was, I think, turned 5 watching it, and when he won it, just beat out the Scarab, I ran back to the pits. People must have thought I was crazy, and got back there and I said, congratulated him, and I said, whenever I have a good race with somebody, doesn't matter whether we won or not, I like to go over and shake their hands and say, that was lots of fun. He had a chance to do that. The driver of the Scarab came over on his own volition. That driver was Rob Walton. Now, I want to go back to one other fact related to the Scarab. Twice at the Historics, I did qualify behind it, but I never could beat Don Orozco. He was just a fine driver, and I just couldn't keep up with him. But as in the prehistorics race, I finished second. Then in the historics race of the next weekend, I finished third. Well, for that, I managed to get the award for presentation and performance, which you're familiar with there. Well, David got the award for presentation and performance for his 2 weeks in the car. As far as I know, this is the only special, the same car that has won the presentation and performance with 2 different drivers. So, the monster did well. Anyway.
And I have been very fortunate to get to know guys like Rob just through my dad, and Rob is probably a guy I met when I was 7 or 8 years old for the first time, but we had never raced wheel to wheel together, and this weekend was, well, these 2 weekends were really significant, not only because I beat the Scarab, but because I had these really great wheel-to-wheel races with Rob Walton in the Scarab. And Rob was aware that, well, the Monserati was my favorite car, the Scarab was also my favorite car, and Rob was very aware of that. And a couple of years, actually 4 years after this photo was taken, I was working late one night, and I got a call come up on my cell phone, and it's Rob Walton. So you take this call when he calls. And he said, well, you know, I'm bringing 3 cars after the Historics this year. I really want to support the 50 sports car group, and I know you've always loved that Scarab. How would you like to drive it? And, you know, I thought, well, God, that's going to be a little awkward with Jankowski. I'm going to have to call him and tell him I'm not going to drive the Monserati. But I think if he was in my shoes, he'd understand, and he'd probably do the same thing. And, you know, I just want to say the Monserati has been such an amazing stepping stone for me, because I ended up driving that Scarab in 2013 and winning the Monterey Historics, and that was the first of 3 times I got to drive that car, and that led to Rob inviting me to drive his 300S Maserati, his 450S Maserati, his Chaparral 1, and several other cars. And actually, he's invited me to drive the Scarab again in Monterey this year. It'll be 7 years since I last drove it, so really looking forward to that. But you know, it's just been such a stepping stone for me to get to drive these cars that I never dreamed I would get a chance to drive. So thank you, Bill. So
I
this
think
is
that's a
the,
good point in which to thank the people who came here. I enjoyed talking to you. Hope you enjoyed it, and maybe we can do it again someday.
we'll be happy to take any questions. The Monserati is still going. This is our last race, which was November in Sears Point at the Velocity Invitational, and we will have it out again on track in October at next Velocity. So I think this conversation's been fairly comprehensive, but if you have any questions, we'll be happy to take any. Gary.
Compare the experience with the Scarab. How did they differ for you when you drove it?
I gotta pick my words carefully here. The Monserati the Monserati is surprisingly effective considering the sum of its parts. When you consider it's a 1939 chassis with drilled drum brakes, you know, it's not a very sophisticated car technically, but it's been quite well sorted over the years, and is pretty fast when you look at the components on paper. You know, the Scarab is just a whole nother level of technical sophistication. The Scarab has a fuel injection setup, so it's you know, a carbureted V8, you know, coming out of a slow corner like turn 11 at Sears Point. You really got to roll on the throttle to avoid, you know, over carbureting it. The Scarab is a car that is just so you know, razor sharp in terms of throttle response and steering response. You know, the Monserati, you can do a lot of this, and the Scarab is very precise, and you know, this car is very effective, but after I drove the Scarab, I thought, how the hell did I ever beat this thing driving the Monserati? So.
There is a letter, there's C on all the early cars. So was there an A, B, and this was a Class C racer, or what was the designation?
B was normally the largest displacement.
Okay.
I don't remember what the numbers were, but conventionally there were more C cars. But there were some B cars that, you know, were well bored out Chevrolets and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that would have been the C modified class of SCCA road racing.
Was there a D class there behind it?
There was,
Oh, yeah, there were
down to H.
D, E, and F, I believe.
Okay. H modifieds were like Crosley specials and things, and as displacement went up, so did the class numerals. Oh, we got two over here. Here and then Alan.
Yeah, on your first engine, how much horsepower did that have?
The Flathead, how much horsepower do you think the Flathead has?
Not enough.
I mean, estimate.
I really don't know.
Okay.
You know, the Flathead was a relatively inefficient engine with dual, it's single exhaust for the two center cylinders on each side. And that didn't help the cooling problem either. Cooling
I'm going to
was a
guess
problem.
that Flathead might have been, what, 120, 130 horsepower?
I would
And the
guess.
Chevy is probably,
Horsepower too.
Never have enough.
the Chevy is probably, what, 350 or so, so it's a considerable delta.
Yeah. That was my second question. How much was this?
Quite a bit more. Enough that if it lost 100 horsepower, we could probably run the same lap time.
And you never got to the point where it's fuel injected?
No, never ran fuel injection, unless I'm mistaken.
That's right.
I think Alan in the back had a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you've ever thought of giving the Monserati exposure to racing in Europe. I'm thinking particularly of Goodwood Revival. I think it could be a huge hit there.
We have talked about it. The furthest I've had the Monserati is Lime Rock. I brought it to the Lime Rock Historic Festival 8 or 10 years ago. We have thought about the idea of going to Goodwood. That would definitely be a dream. We don't have FIA papers for the Monserati currently, but that would certainly be a dream one day, would be to take it there. And I think that the Brits would love to see it sliding through Magic Corner. One more over here.
There's a company in either North or South Carolina that specializes in building very, very small but super horsepower flatheads. Their newest flathead that it took a year to engineer, assemble, put together, and run at Bonneville, got quite a few records. It's a 266 cubic inch flathead. It's turbocharged. Makes 722 horsepower and 640 pound-feet of torque.
And it runs for about 5 minutes before it blows up, it sounds like.
Actually, they ran for 9 hours on the dyno at 622 pound-feet of torque.
Is that an
We'll
original
have to
block?
look into a new powertrain option, Bill.
If I recall correctly, in SEC back in the 50s and 60s, supercharging it boosted it up one class automatically.
Well, thank you all for listening. Nobody threw anything at us, so I feel great about that. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, David. This has been just a wonderful experience. so happy both of you made it.
Gary, it's our pleasure. Thank you for having us.